The human psyche can be as delicate as an eggshell.
I was always very self-conscious, and I've had very low self-esteem because I've had like this complex about being dark-skinned.
The desire for love and to be loved made her extremely vulnerable.
And the quest for validation can create the perfect conditions for manipulation.
Whatever she was going through by herself, the devil put him right there in front of her.
He's like, for now on, it's gonna be what I say.
Even the most unlikely person can find themselves trapped in a destructive situation.
So police could see them reaching under the seat, and they knew that it was about to explode into violence.
We're dealing with two armed individuals, and the bullet don't care who fires it.
If she was in the right state of mind, she would have never done that. Never.
In the end, their choices can irreparably alter the course of their life.
Criminals that operate in the manner that he operates don't succeed for very long. They're also the most dangerous.
At that moment, I knew, like, okay, I knew it was real. I knew that I was in trouble.
October 11th, 2017, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a cool, crisp autumn evening in the Midwest.
Milwaukee is an ethnically and culturally diverse city.
It's a fantastic city. It's got a lot of diversity. It's got great parks. It's got a great lakefront. It's got great festivals.
But the city has also gained notoriety for being racially segregated, and its disparities in employment and income levels affecting black residents.
It's very segregated. There's rivers and bridges, and you cross them and the whole world changes.
Unfortunately, the city has grappled with crime, specifically homicides, far exceeding other cities. The city is also dealing with other violent types of crime.
The city's police department does what it can to crack down on the lawlessness. But a new case emerges. At 4 p.m. on October 9th, a call comes into the police department reporting an armed robbery at a sub shop just north of downtown Milwaukee.
So officers come to the scene and they interview the only employee that's there.
The employees told officers that a black male entered their store and ordered a sub. As the man waited by the cash register, a black female came into the store.
So the employee opens the cash register, but she comes up, pushes the customer aside, takes out a handgun, and demands the money.
The woman reached over the counter and began removing cash from the register, stuffing it inside a black bag she brought with her.
The employee described the female as black, in her 20s, medium height, medium build. She was wearing all black with a gray baseball cap.
The most distinguishing thing about her is a pink handgun. Of course, the employee had never seen anything like that. He actually thought it was a toy at first, but he could tell by the way she was acting that this, in fact, was not a toy. The employee recalled that there was around $800 in the cash register.
What struck me a little bit differently, there's a female involved. It's pretty uncommon for you to see a female involved. She might be the getaway driver or given some sort of job like that, but not carrying a gun and grabbing money and stuff. That was a little out of the ordinary.
The other thing that's unusual is that she wasn't wearing a mask. Robbers typically try to hide their identity. This suggests that perhaps she was an amateur, her first time doing this.
3 hours later, Milwaukee police receive another 911 call, this time from a Mexican fast food restaurant just 6 miles away.
The call comes in, and the employee is letting the police know that this time there are 2 armed robbers. One is a woman, and one is a man.
Detectives arrived on the scene to interview the employees. The description they give is similar to the woman at the sub shop. Medium height, medium build, mid-20s. They described her as wearing all black and carrying a black duffel bag. The gun used was a pink semi-automatic, the same as in the sub shop, which makes them think that the 2 robberies are related.
The other robber is described as a black male in his mid-20s, who is also medium height and build. Witnesses say he wore a white t-shirt and black baseball cap and was armed with a black semi-automatic handgun.
So the employee recollection is 2 armed robbers come in, brandishing guns. They make everyone get on the ground, and the man watches over, making sure no one moves, while she grabs the money and actually stuffs it into her purse.
The employees say that the male suspect took a phone from one of them and also some sunglasses. Once they collected the money, they fled the restaurant on foot.
Police immediately radio the dispatcher with a description of the suspects. Then they realize they may have caught a break.
The employee whose phone was stolen reveals it is an iPhone, and everyone knows iPhones have the Find My iPhone app on them.
Police use an app to find that the phone was pinging on North 7th and Hampton, about a mile away from the Mexican restaurant. So the dispatcher sent several units to the area, hoping to find the robbers.
At this point, police realize that there is an active crime spree underway. They're not exactly sure who is doing it or when they'll strike next, but they are starting to close in.
Based on the suspects' use of guns in the robberies, police are concerned the spree could escalate.
Robberies are considered crimes of violence, despite the fact that most times no one is injured. But the presence of a gun means potential violence is always present.
So the employees of the Mexican restaurant tell police that the robbers threatened to shoot them if they did not follow their orders to the letter.
One of the workers said that the male suspect pointed a gun at him that he recognized to be a .380. The male suspect then forced him on the ground.
They told police that the gunman saw the employee move his hand and thought he had activated the silent alarm.
The gunman starts screaming. He's asking, "Did you activate the alarm?" The employee says, "No, I didn't do anything." He's panicking at this point. The gunman then says, "If you move your hand an inch, I will shoot you dead."
There was another employee who said that she was approached by a female gunman, and she was ordered to open the register. The employee tried to open it, but she was so nervous she couldn't even get it open.
The robber points this pink gun at the employee and said, "If this cash register is not open by the time I count to 5, I'm gonna shoot you dead." She tries it again, and this time the cash register opens. Were they just bluffing, or would they have really shot the employees? Now, if you're one of the employees, you have no way of knowing, so you have to assume the worst.
Moments later, the gunman entered the restaurant's office. Inside was a male employee.
The employee's iPhone was in the office on the charger. The robber grabbed the phone and stuffed it inside his pocket, and the two suspects fled on foot.
The restaurant manager says that the two robbers made off with around $650 from the store that night.
With two bold, back-to-back armed robberies, police were on edge. They believed if the suspects were not found soon, somebody was bound to get hurt.
Detectives in Milwaukee have been investigating a crime spree. 2 armed robberies within 3 hours at a sub shop and a Mexican restaurant as they search for 2 suspects.
The detectives learned that the suspects were a man and a woman, and they had a clear description of the weapons used, including a pink gun that immediately stood out. One employee also reported that his iPhone was stolen during the robbery.
2 years earlier, Milwaukee police created a robbery task force to crack down on an epidemic of carjackings in the city. The effort was so successful that the department decided to keep the task force operational and focus on other armed robberies.
Our robberies have been getting more organized, been getting more violent. So that task force was basically formed to get some sort of handle on that.
The task force has the ability to respond very quickly, so they'll arrive at the restaurant almost immediately.
Employees tell detectives that the robbers were not wearing gloves, so forensic specialists process cash registers and the front doors for fingerprints. They also try to track the stolen iPhone.
The detectives are able to use Find My iPhone to locate the phone. It turns out that the location is 76 in Hampton, which is just about a mile away.
They monitor the app for several minutes, and the phone appears to be stationary. So detectives begin to wonder, does the robber have the phone, or does he live in the area? If so, they may catch them red-handed.
Several officers race to the phone's location.
Officers search the surrounding area looking for this missing phone. One of the officers looks under some shrubs and notices the glow of a cell phone.
He picked up the phone and realized that it was the victim's phone, so clearly the robbers disposed of it.
So they must have realized that the phone could be trapped, and they got rid of it. Officers don't know if they were just driving by and might have tossed the phone out the window, or if they were actually still on foot. We don't know at this point.
The robbery task force has little to go on and no idea where the suspects may strike next.
At this point, there are all types of questions, but detectives believe that it's the same woman in both robberies because the gun appears to be the same.
The MO for both robberies was similar. Fast food restaurants, they get in and get out very quickly. But now they're making threats of physical violence, so police worry it's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt.
A day passes without any additional robberies. But shortly after 3 p.m. on October 11th, police receive a 911 call from a video game store in a Milwaukee shopping center.
Officers arrive at the scene and begin interviewing employees. One man said he was behind the register when a black man, medium build, medium height, walked up to the register. The man asked the employee about a particular basketball game.
While the man speaks to him, the employee notices a black female enter the store and walk toward the back.
So all of a sudden, the man goes into his sweatshirt pocket and pulls out a black semi-automatic pistol. He points it at the clerk and orders him to get on the ground.
As the man gets on the ground, he hears a female in the back of the store ordering his co-workers to open the cash register. He looks up and sees the woman collecting money and putting it into a black bag. A few minutes later, the robbers fled the store. The employees described them the same as the Mexican restaurant. Medium height, medium build, no mask, and just like in the earlier robberies, the woman had a pink handgun. Clearly, it's the same people.
The employees tell officers that the female robber apparently took a GPS tracking device from the cash register.
Some retail businesses have these tracking devices in their cash registers. The idea is that if there's a theft, the robber would take something that later would be able to track them.
Detectives activate the tracker, and it pings half a mile south of the location.
So here we go again, right? The police race to the scene, hoping that they'll be able to catch the robbers red-handed.
But when police get to the location, they find the tracker lying in the middle of the street.
These crooks are sophisticated enough to check their loot, make sure they don't have anything that will lead detectives to them. The video game store is different than a restaurant, because in a restaurant you don't have to worry about shoplifting. But that's a big problem in video game stores, so a lot of them have surveillance cameras.
Detectives review the surveillance video and confirm the descriptions of the two bandits. But the quality is not sufficient to determine facial features.
So the officers go to some of the nearby stores, hoping that someone may have surveillance cameras. And they get lucky. Several of the stores actually do.
Pouring through the videos, detectives see the two suspects flee the area on foot, racing into a nearby residential neighborhood.
Another video shows the robbers getting into this red sedan, and they peel off at a high rate of speed. The GPS from the cash register is found close by to where the car was parked. So detectives are pretty sure at this point that this is the getaway car. Several of the videos depict this gray discoloration on the back of the car. It's on the rear quarter panel of the sedan. Since red sedans are a very popular car, they're hoping that this discoloration will actually help them to locate the car.
Detectives check the department's stolen car database and discover that a red sedan was stolen 2 days earlier, on October 9th, 2017, the same day as the first two robberies.
Detectives know that a lot of times thieves will steal a car because it helps to shield their identity. Officers believe that's the theory that the robbers are using in this case.
A few hours later, police receive another 911 call from a sub shop located about 4 miles from the video game store. An employee reports that the store has been held up by 2 robbers. This time, shots have been fired inside the restaurant. Police, of course, race to the scene, fearing the worst, that someone has been shot.
As authorities rush to the scene, they are left wondering not only who has been shot, but how bad it is.
There's a saying in the police world, if you commit a crime, commit it alone. And the reason that is said is because you can trust one person, yourself. And the minute you commit a crime and you conspire to do it with a second party, law enforcement is always going to use that as a leverage because there's always an alpha and there's always a beta. And one of you thought that foolishness up and one of you complied and said, that's a great idea. It's very, very rare that you have 2 individuals that commit a crime that have the equal amount of loss at stake.
Investigators have been tracking 2 armed robbers targeting local shops. But despite their efforts, they still have no leads on the suspects' identities. Days later, the suspects struck again in a robbery that escalated into a shooting.
Every attempt they made to track them came up empty. Even the surveillance footage obtained of the robbers couldn't determine their identity. Then, a couple of days after the first robbery, they hit another sub shop.
The police arrived. One of the employees at the sub shop is an 18-year-old high school senior, Mary Williams. This is her first day on the job.
She tells detectives that shortly after 6 p.m., she was in the back room taking a phone call. She heard a commotion and saw two individuals threatening her co-workers.
Williams describes the suspects as a black male and a black female armed with a pink handgun.
She said the female suspect pointed her gun at her and ordered her to put her phone down. Then the female suspect picked it up and put it in her pocket. She demanded to know where the safe was, but Williams told her this was her first day and she didn't know where it was.
Seconds later, the robber enters the office. He tells her to put her head down and do not look up. She's afraid that she's gonna die. She starts crying. Seconds later, she hears him walk back out to the front of the store where the other employee is.
Suddenly, a shot rings out, reverberating throughout the sub shop.
This made Williams more upset, and she began crying even harder. She didn't look up. A moment later, she heard what sounded like two people running out of the shop. She looked around and couldn't see anyone. She was scared to death.
After the robbers flee, she gets up and begins searching for her coworker.
She finds a coworker in the front of the store. Luckily, he's unharmed. He points to the surveillance camera by the register. He says he shot the camera. The employees estimate approximately $500 was stolen from the restaurant.
Williams informs the police that her iPhone was also stolen.
Once again, police run the Find My iPhone app. They find a location. It's about a mile from the shop. Unfortunately, as soon as they get there, they find the phone discarded on the ground. No robbers.
An hour later, the armed assailants strike another sub shop, getting away with almost $250 in cash. But this time, shortly after, they are spotted by police.
7:54, there are two officers sitting in an unmarked car. They are at the corner of Green Bay Avenue and Hampton Avenue. The officers notice a red sedan on the opposite side of the intersection. So the officers roll their car through the intersection, make a U-turn, and pull up next to the red sedan. So the officers both notice on the back of the red sedan, there's a gray spot. So if the officers call it in and they learn that the license plate matched the stolen car from the Bolo.
The police dispatcher sends other marked police cars to the area. Within minutes, officers begin converging on the sedan, unsure what danger they may face.
I'm sitting in the passenger seat and I see these lights. I said, "Do you got anything on you?" He pulled out the gun from on him. I said, "Set it down." He set it down and I had that money on my lap. So I stuffed it under the seat and the police is still, I said, "This not a traffic stop." And he said, "What?" As soon as I said that, they just start coming from everywhere. And boom, they bust the car windows out. And I was like, no, I'm gonna get out.
Police pull the man out of the driver's seat. He's identified as 27-year-old Dion Batten. The woman is 25-year-old Laura Lee Walton. Laura Lee Walton was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
I didn't have like a perfect upbringing, but it was nothing bad. Like, my mom was good. Like, she did everything she could. She bought us everything she could. I got two sisters. We 3 years apart, so it was always the four of us, me, my mom, my two sisters.
My mom is very close to all three of her kids, very close. Besides her being our mom, she is our best friend. And her and my big sister, they just alike. They both so smart.
Laura's mother prioritized education, making certain all three girls graduated high school and got a chance at a college education.
As soon as I graduated, I took a break. I took a break for like 6 months because I wanted to save some money and I wanted to pay for some stuff by myself instead of accumulating all them loans and stuff like that. So I saved some money. And so then when I went to school, I went for criminal justice.
But after a few years, her career goals suddenly changed.
My granddad ended up getting sick. So they pulled my granddad out of a nursing home and put him in the house. My older cousin, she was going to be a nurse. So she was teaching me how to do stuff with him and just how to. So my granddad ended up dying and I decided, okay, well, what do I have to do to take care of people? And so that's when I had another cousin. He was a CNA and he told me about that. So I went to school. I switched my major over to nursing. So then I got my first job and I loved it. So that's what I've been doing ever since, the medical field. I loved it. It was exactly what I wanted to do.
I always look up to her because she's so smart. She graduated with a 4.0. She was in volleyball. She did basketball. She truly is a gift. I always wanted to be just like her. I always wanted to have everything that she has.
Laura's love life, on the other hand, moves slowly, in part because of her self-esteem issues.
I was always very self-conscious. When I was younger, I was the only dark-skinned girl. And so they would say stuff like, oh, nobody likes dark-skinned girls, or dark-skinned girls come last. So they would say stuff like that. So ever since then, I've had like this complex about being dark-skinned.
So a lot of people feel like they get treated differently because, oh, your skin is darker, so you're not that much important to the world than a fair-skinned person.
At 21, she began dating a man named Sean, and a year later, she gave birth to a son, Levi. But the relationship ran hot and cold.
They argued constantly, and it was clear that the relationship wasn't going to last. So when it ended, she was eager to find a new love.
One night in September 2017, Laura stopped at a gas station and noticed a man at the pump next to her.
He was like, hey, and I was like, hi. As I'm getting in the car, he's like, hey, can I talk to you? And I was like, what's up? And then he was like, you're very pretty, like you're beautiful. Now, when I hear those words like, you're pretty, you're beautiful, it hits different because they didn't say because to be dark-skinned. So that's what even made me initially have the conversation.
The man introduced himself as Dion Batten.
So we sat there, we talked for a few minutes. He was like, can I call you? So I said, you could give me your number. And he was like, okay, cool. He gave me his number and that was that. He went his way, I went my way.
Just a few days later, while Laura was in the neighborhood, Dion happened to drive by.
So Dion sees her. He immediately pulls over and says, what's up? She, tells him, I've been busy, I've been meaning to call you back. But he keeps flirting, and this time it works. And from that day forward, the two were inseparable.
I liked the attention because I knew it was genuine. I was just intrigued that he thought I was pretty. And not because I was dark-skinned. He would come over, we would sit on the porch, like I would take rides with him, like stuff like that.
But now, Dion Batten and Laura Walton have been arrested and taken into police custody.
I didn't know what was going to happen. I really didn't, but whatever it was, I knew I didn't have to be in that situation.
Following a series of armed robberies, detectives have captured the two suspects after spotting their getaway car at an intersection. 27-year-old Dion Batten and 25-year-old Laura Lee Walton.
Authorities converged on the vehicle and took the pair into custody, transporting them to the station for questioning about the multiple robberies.
So it's clear to police that Laura Walton is on some type of drug. They don't know exactly what it is, and she's definitely not telling them. And so they decide to put them up, and hopefully holding them overnight, things will be different when they question them again in the morning.
They do search the red sedan and find items associated with the robbery. Under the driver's seat, they find a loaded 9mm handgun. On the passenger side, they find a black duffel bag, and inside the duffel bag, a .380 caliber pink pistol.
Inside the duffel bag, police find almost $1,000 in cash. And then in the console of the car, they find an additional $842.
The next morning, detectives take Walton and Batten into separate interrogation rooms.
Anytime it's two suspects, you keep them separate to stop them from coordinating their stories. You question them simultaneously to compare their answers. You want to expose any consistencies and use them against each other to expose the truth.
Dion Batten is questioned, and he tells the police he doesn't know anything about any robberies. He says that Laura is his girlfriend, but he was just driving her to work at her job at a nursing home when they were pulled over and questioned by police.
They asked him how did he come to be driving the red sedan. Mind you, they already knew it was stolen. And Dion said he rented the car from a girl named Mandy for $50.
Batten volunteers that he owns a gun and typically keeps it underneath the driver's seat for personal protection.
He has an answer for everything they throw at him. The car's not stolen, I'm renting it. It's normal for my gun to be under the seat.
Dion's reaction is that of someone who's been through the system. He knows what's at stake. He knows that everything's going to be used against him. He's not going to cooperate with the police.
In an adjacent interrogation room, another detective is interviewing Laura Walton.
The detectives think that Laura will probably also deny everything, because that's what criminals do.
Detectives start by asking her about her appearance the night before, because it appears disheveled, like she's on something. This time, Laura admits that she is addicted to painkillers, Percocets.
They asked me, did I still feel under the influence? I told them no. They asked me, did I take any Percocets before the situation? I said yes. Did I take any before I got questioned? And I said no.
Laura explains that she first became addicted to Percocet after the birth of her son.
I got diagnosed with arthritis when I was 18. So I was taking like little stuff here and there, but after I had ended up getting an epidural with Levi, my back was just so horrible. So I was getting prescribed at the doctor.
She says that when her prescription ran out, she began having new symptoms.
My body hurt so bad, I was sweating. My stomach was cramping up, and I could not for the life understand what was wrong. So I have an auntie and an uncle that had drug addiction problems. And so my auntie told me, she was like, you're sick from not having Percocets. So she gave me a Percocet, and I felt better. So I went back to the pain management, and I was like, listen, I need to be back on the pills that would put me back on them.
If someone's taking addictive medications such as Percocets or any other painkiller, they would probably 9 times out of 10 they'll become addicted to it.
According to Laura, she soon required more of the drug to get the same high.
My tolerance was going up, so I found other ways to get them. One of the ways I started getting them, it wasn't prostitution, it wasn't none of that, but it was definitely something that should have never been happening. That's when it dawned on me that I was addicted. I couldn't go to work without them. I couldn't wake up without them. I couldn't move around without them.
When the detective asks Laura about the robberies, she surprises him by readily admitting her involvement.
They was like, tell me what happened. I told them everything. I did it willingly on my own. And they had told me, well, where did the money come from that was in the car? I said, it came from the robberies.
Laura walks the detective through all 5 of the robberies.
I was just like, yeah, then we went here, and then I did this, and I said this, and I took this. He kept saying something. Did he make you do that? Well, what did he do? And I was like, no, I did it on my own. Nobody made me, you know. I did this, I did that. I told him everything about the robberies and stuff like that. And he asked me, is it any more that you've done? I said, no, never, you know. I told them everything.
Laura takes full responsibility for the robberies and makes sure to protect her man in the process. She insists to detectives that she acted alone.
Laura recalls detectives discussing the case and having a hard time accepting that she wasn't coerced by Dion.
I heard them kept saying, she had to been following him. She had to be. I just kept hearing him say that. In the interview, the detective, whatever he wasn't mean to me at all. He wasn't rude to me. He wasn't aggressive. They just kept saying, this is not making sense.
With Laura's confession in hand, detectives confront Dion Batten.
The detectives say, look, I know you're denying everything, but Laura already confessed to all 5 robberies, so you might as well start telling the truth.
So according to him, Laura is the one that suggested the robbery. She worked at a sub shop before, and so she felt like she knew how they operated. He also said that Laura needed the money to pay the rent. So Batten explains that he was the customer in the first sub shop, but acknowledges that they robbed the Mexican restaurant together.
While he say Laura is the one who came up with the robberies, he quickly got addicted to the adrenaline and fast money.
Dion says that 2 days later, Laura told him her electricity had been turned off and she needed more money to pay the bill.
Batten says he needed more money, and so they both decided together to commit more robberies.
They said they would stick in the restaurants, but the one they went to had too many customers, so they robbed the video store instead.
After the video game store, they went on to rob 2 more restaurants before the car they were driving was identified by police and they were arrested.
Both Laura Walton and Dion Batten are charged with armed robbery. When they appear at their first bond hearing, Laura receives a shock.
My bond was literally thousands of dollars more than his. And the judge is saying, how dare you manipulate this man to do this? And you have a child, you're a disgrace to the community. And I'm like, what the he talking about? And when we walked out, I asked the lawyer, I said, what is going on? And now she said, baby, you in some trouble. She said, this young man has said that you came up with this plan, you coerced him, it was all your idea, he was following your lead. And it was like, what? So at that moment, I knew, like, okay, I knew it was real. I knew that I was.
Laura Walton and Dion Batten have been charged with committing 5 armed robberies in Milwaukee. At her first bond hearing, Laura learns prosecutors believe she is the mastermind behind the crimes.
During her interrogation, Laura admitted her role in the crimes. What she didn't realize was Dion was telling the police it was all her idea.
Laura is grappling with a Percocet addiction, and then on the other hand, she's also trying to hold on to this relationship that she's low-key obsessed with. The result of both of those things is she's not understanding the reality of the trouble that she's in and what she's actually done.
Laura's attorney warns her that her addiction is limiting his ability to defend her.
As I start sobering up, he started dropping the bombs on me, like, this is what's being said. This is what's going on. Right now, you're facing a lot of time because right now, you are the mastermind. I said, that is not true. He said, unless you sober up and get to talking, you're going to go to prison for a very long time.
Laura explains to her attorney that the idea for the robberies began shortly after Dion realized she had a drug problem.
Kept my Percocets in my book bag. I left my book bag in his car. So at about 2 o'clock in the morning, I noticed I forgot my book bag. So I called him and I'm like, hey, I left my book bag in your car. Give me my book bag. And he's like, okay, sure. So he pulled the pills out of his pocket. He said, is this what you want your bag for? I said, why was you going through my stuff? And he said, I know a drug addict when I see one. He's like, from now on, it's going to be what I say. He said, do you know what will happen to Levi if the system finds out that you are a drug addict? And I was like, what? He was like, they'll take him and you won't have no baby. He said, do you know you'll lose your job and everything? I'll make you lose your job. And I was like, okay, all right.
She didn't want anybody to know, not her family or anyone to know, that she was using these substances. So Dion took that into consideration, and at that point, he started to manipulate her.
Laura says that a few days later, Dion complains that he lost his job and needs money.
He was like, I gotta find a way to make some money because this ain't hitting on nothing. I said, well, just get another job or whatever. And he was like, I got a better idea.
She tells her lawyer that Dion said he knew a woman who drives an armored truck.
He said, I think that we should rob an armored truck. She gonna give me the whole play. I said, I'm not robbing no armored truck. He said to me, if I tell about your little secret life, you going down, you're not gonna have no job, and they gonna take your son. So what you gonna do? I said, okay, this is what we can do. I said, my first job was a fast food restaurant. I said, we could do something like that because if it's anything like the same, I know the workings of it.
Laura says that after she committed the first robbery, Dion complained that they didn't get enough money.
And I was like, that gotta be enough. He was like, we're gonna have to do another one. And I was like, can you just give me some more Percocets? Like, just give me some more Percocets and I'll do whatever you say.
People struggling with addiction find themselves often doing things they would not normally do. In order to get that next fix, many times they'll literally do anything. And that is exactly what happened to Laura.
It's basically grooming of a conspirator to commit a crime. The minute you're controlling their pills, you own her soul. You can make her do anything.
The second robbery nets them more money, but Laura claims Dion still isn't satisfied. 2 days later, he gets more Percocet from a dealer. Laura explains the drugs fueled her compliance for 3 more robberies. Then, on the evening of October 11th, 2017, they were spotted by police.
Oh God, I was so relieved. I was so relieved because I knew I did not have to, whatever happened, I knew I did not have to deal with him no more.
Addiction doesn't just impact the body, but it weakens emotional defenses, leaving individuals vulnerable to manipulation. The overwhelming craving for relief, whether physical or emotional, can drive individuals to trust the wrong people or take actions that they never imagined. Under the grip of addiction, the drugs take control. blurring the lines between choice and coercion, and making them easy targets for exploitation.
Upon realizing Dion Batten had pinned the robbery solely on her, 25-year-old Laura Walton changed her story, claiming he used her drug addiction to force her into the crimes. Laura's attorney presents the evidence of her addiction and Dion's coercion to prosecutors during plea bargain discussions.
So Dion Batten had been involved in a domestic violence case long before he met Laura. So Laura's attorney used this information about his violent past, along with other evidence, to prove that she was not the ringleader, and all evidence pointed to Dion.
Because handguns were used in the crimes, both Dion Batten and Laura Walton are charged under federal statutes.
Discharging a firearm during a crime of violence carries a mandatory 10-year prison sentence. Brandishing a firearm has a mandatory sentence of 7 years. Laura pleads guilty to 5 counts of robbery and 1 count of brandishing a firearm. She is sentenced to 10 years in prison. Because Dion Batten fired his gun at a surveillance camera, he ends up pleading guilty, and he is sentenced to 12.5 years.
Once she's behind bars, Laura has trouble adjusting to prison life.
It was real hard. I ain't gonna lie, that was hard. I had a hard time with fitting into that prison community. Whether it was the officers, whether it was the inmates, for them to come in your room and turn it upside down, empty your stuff out, and just walk away. Like, it feels so violating. It sucks.
But she quickly learned that pushing back only makes things worse.
I stayed in a SHU. That's called the Special Housing Unit. It's jail inside of jail. I stayed in there a lot. And it's nothing in there but a bed, a toilet. You get no commissary. You get no books. You get no mail. It's a shower in there, and that's it. You in the room all day.
Laura even shuts herself off from her family.
She was very, alone, isolated. She wouldn't talk to us at all. So me and her started writing for a little bit, but still, I can tell, she still wasn't open to tell me what happened, because I would ask her questions, and she wouldn't answer them. I know for a fact she was ashamed, because that's not who she is.
The hardest part is being separated from her son, who was just 2 years old when she was arrested.
I talked to my son on the phone. We did video visits, and last time I seen him, he was 2, turning 3. So I don't know this person. I feel like what mother don't know their kid? So I felt very belittled because my mom had to tell me what he liked, what he didn't like. It was bad. It was real bad.
As her release date approaches, Laura is both excited and nervous.
It was a constant thought in my head. Was I gonna be able to get a job? I just didn't know what was gonna come next. Because everybody say, oh, when you get out of prison, it's hard to find a job because you're a felon. And, it's hard to do, it's just hard to function in life. So I came out real nervous.
When that day finally arrives, Laura finds good fortune on her side.
Surprisingly, I was very blessed. My first ever job interview, I did get the job. It was in the medical field. I thought I was not going to be able to use my license no more because of my crime, but I am able to use my license.
It was just a blessing, and then to look at her and be like, dang, you came home and you got right back on it. How did you do that? It was awesome.
More importantly, she is able to rebuild her relationship with her son, Levi.
He was very, very shy, but he was very open. So that was like a relief. Okay, that was a relief. I learned he's very, very forgiving. So I asked him, is he mad at me? And he says no. He never asked me what happened, but if he ever asks me one day, I'll tell him. But we're taking it slow.
In the end, Laura has learned some valuable lessons.
The Percocet problem that I had, I wasn't worried about my family being mad, but I was worried about them being disappointed in me. But I feel like had I would have actually asked for help, that none of it would have happened. So it is okay to ask for help. Don't be embarrassed, because if you got a good support system in family, they want you to ask for help.
She's always been a very mature and independent, but when she came out of there, she had a different brain on a different level, even when it comes to survival and things like that she had learned inside of there.
Laura feels her biggest mistake was getting involved with a manipulative man.
He was doing it because he likes control. And I feel like he had Laura doing things under his control because it made him feel important. Once he found out that she was using substances, he had every reason that he wanted to control her.
She cared for this man and craved the attention that he gave her. Combined with her addiction, this made her more vulnerable to his manipulation. She went along with what he wanted in the haze of drugs.
The red velvet curtains of the Atlanta Opera House were not the only things draped in mystery that winter evening in 1999. Beneath the polished veneer of the city's elite, a silent, lethal shadow was tracing a path toward the estate of Julian Thorne. A titan of the telecommunications boom, Thorne was a man whose influence was matched only by the number of enemies he had collected in his climb to the summit of Georgia's corporate hierarchy. When his lifeless body was discovered in the master study of his Buckhead mansion, the scene was an orchestration of cold, clinical precision. No forced entry, no missing jewelry, no scattered papers, only the singular, devastating silence of an executioner's work. For 27 years, this case stood as a monumental insult to the Atlanta Police Department, a chilling reminder that in a city of millions, a phantom could walk into a fortress, erase a life, and vanish into the humid night without leaving so much as a stray fingerprint. The case was officially buried in the archives of unsolved cold cases, a file thick with unproven theories of corporate sabotage, bitter ex-partners, and rumors of a dark, illicit debt that Thorne had never intended to pay. But in the world of high-stakes crime, time is not merely a healer. It is a magnifying glass, and tonight, the lens is finally focused on the one name that stayed hidden beneath the layers of privilege and professional silence, a contract killer known only as the Architect, whose shadow has finally been cast into the light of justice. The Buckhead district of Atlanta in the late 90s was an epicenter of opulence, where gated drives and manicured lawns protected the secrets of the ultra-wealthy from the prying eyes of the public. Julian Thorne's estate, a sprawling Tudor-style manor, was the jewel of the neighborhood, a place where business deals were cemented over vintage scotch and late-night calls to London and Tokyo. On the night of December 14th, 1999, the security cameras surrounding the perimeter experienced a momentary, 3-minute glitch, a digital hiccup that the original security team dismissed as a power surge, but which detectives would later realize was the precise window of a professional infiltration. The intruder had not come to loot. They had come to settle an account. Thorne was found seated in his high-backed leather chair, a glass of water on his desk, his expression one of mild surprise, as if he had been interrupted by a business associate rather than an assassin. There was no struggle, no weapon left behind, and no forensic evidence to suggest the killer had been anything other than a professional ghost who knew exactly which gate to bypass, which lock to shim, and how to exit before the guards completed their midnight rounds. When the lead investigators arrived, the scene was eerily pristine, a paradox that haunted them from the first hour. Atlanta homicide veteran Detective Marcus Vane, a man who had seen every iteration of domestic violence and street crime, stood in the center of the study and felt a cold shiver of professional intimidation. This was not the work of a disgruntled employee or a lover's quarrel. It was the work of a shadow who understood the architecture of death. Thorne had been silenced with a single, sophisticated injection of a paralytic agent that left no bruising, no defensive wounds, and no immediate cause of death that a standard coroner's report would identify without specialized toxicology. The killer had operated with a terrifying, rhythmic efficiency, leaving the house exactly as he found it, save for the heart that had stopped beating in the chair. The community of Buckhead was paralyzed, residents installing panic rooms and armed patrols, while the press turned Thorne's murder into a sensation, speculating on the high-level secrets he might have taken to the grave, yet no suspect ever emerged from the haze of the investigation. The subsequent months turned into a grueling, demoralizing hunt that led detectives through the labyrinthine world of corporate espionage, offshore bank accounts, and clandestine meetings in downtown hotels. They interviewed rival CEOs, jilted business associates, and the inner circle of Thorne's own security detail, only to find that every single one of them had ironclad, if suspiciously perfect, alibis. The investigation into the telecommunications empire Thorne controlled revealed a web of debt and questionable mergers, but none of the players involved seemed capable of commissioning a hit that was this surgical. The case file grew bloated with dead ends, whispers of the architect, and fringe rumors that Thorne had been involved with something far more dangerous than the stock market, perhaps a shadow government project or a connection to international arms dealing, but none of it could be proven. The files were eventually archived, the case moved to the cold case unit, and for years, the only thing that moved in the Thorne matter was the accumulation of dust on the yellowing evidence boxes in a remote, temperature-controlled facility on the outskirts of the city. For nearly 3 decades, the Thorne execution remained a ghost story told in the break rooms of the Atlanta precinct, a case that proved the limitations of human effort when faced with a predator who was several steps ahead of the law. The detectives who had initially processed the scene retired, moved away, or passed on, and the memory of the millionaire who had everything, only to lose it in a 3-minute window of silence, faded from the public eye. The Thorne estate was sold, renovated, and sold again, the original layout of the study altered, the very floorboards where the killer had stood pulled up and replaced, effectively destroying the physical crime scene for good. It seemed the perfect crime had finally achieved its ultimate goal, total, irreversible oblivion. But the law, when fueled by the persistence of technology and the evolution of genetic genealogy, has a way of finding the cracks in even the most perfect of armors, and in 2026, those cracks finally began to widen. The breakthrough did not come from a tip or a confession, but from a scrap of DNA recovered from the inner rim of a whiskey glass that had been sitting in the corner of Thorne's study, overlooked by forensic teams in 1999 because they assumed it belonged to a guest at a dinner party held days before. A newly formed cold case task force, utilizing the cutting-edge DNA extraction methods that had become the gold standard in recent years, managed to isolate a profile from the rim of that glass that hadn't been processed in the original investigation. It wasn't just any profile, it was a genetic fingerprint that, when uploaded to a national genealogy database, linked to a lineage of men who had been active in the criminal underworld of the 80s and 90s. The algorithms began to weave a web of connections, tracking second cousins and distant uncles until they arrived at a name that had been tucked away in a witness protection program for the better part of 20 years, Arthur Penhaligon. Penhaligon was a man who had been a ghost in his own right, living under a series of pseudonyms in the Pacific Northwest, claiming to be a retired long-haul trucker, his history meticulously scrubbed by an anonymous entity known only as the Agency. He was a man who fit the profile of the contract killer perfectly: military background, a history of handling classified materials, and a complete lack of a criminal record that could be verified through traditional means. The task force began to shadow him, not with sirens and neon lights, but with the quiet, devastating precision of a sniper. They monitored his digital movements, his social circles, and his physical health, waiting for the moment when his carefully constructed wall of anonymity would falter. They discovered that Penhaligon was not just a retired trucker. He was a man who had been paid millions in untraceable crypto assets to do the dirty work of men who sat in skyscrapers and dictated the course of the future. The arrest of Arthur Penhaligon was conducted in the quiet of a Tuesday morning in a nondescript apartment in Seattle, without a single word being exchanged, as the tactical team breached the door. The man they found was old, frail, and seemingly harmless, a grandfather who spent his days feeding birds in the park. Yet the moment the handcuffs snapped shut, he looked at the lead investigator with an eerie, knowing calm. He didn't ask why he was being taken, he didn't call for a lawyer, and he didn't protest the charge of murder. He simply stood up, his joints creaking, and muttered, "I knew you'd eventually find the glass." It was a confession born of a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, the final resignation of a ghost who was tired of hiding in the fog of a forgotten past. The journey back to Atlanta was a somber, high-security procession that marked the end of the longest-running hit job mystery in the city's history. The courtroom proceedings in Atlanta, which began in late 2026, became a national sensation, a theater where the secrets of the 90s were finally laid bare for all to witness. Penhaligon did not play the role of the monster. He played the role of the professional, providing the court with a detailed, chilling account of how he was contacted, how he was paid, and how he had been commissioned to eliminate Thorne by a group of partners who were frightened by the millionaire's plan to whistleblow on their illegal accounting practices. He provided names of men who were now CEOs, senators, and billionaires, people who had spent the last 27 years enjoying the fruits of a murder that had been orchestrated in the shadows. The revelations triggered a cascade of indictments that reached into the highest echelons of the Atlanta establishment, turning the Thorne case into a case study of institutional corruption and the dark price of corporate greed. As the trial reached its crescendo, the emotional weight of the Thorne murder finally found a resting place in the hearts of the community that had been haunted by it for so long. The conviction of Penhaligon was not just a win for the cold case squad. It was a vindication of the idea that no matter how much money, influence, or distance a killer puts between themselves and their crime, the truth is an indelible record that cannot be expunged. Julian Thorne, a man who had been a symbol of the excess and secrecy of the turn of the century, had finally received the justice he was denied on that winter night in 1999. The story of his execution, tied to the enigmatic architect, had become a cautionary tale that would define the city's forensic history for generations to come, reminding everyone that the past is never truly buried. It is only waiting for the light to catch it. The city of Atlanta has returned to its vibrant, bustling rhythm, the shadows of Buckhead no longer carrying the same weight of secrets they once did. The Thorne Mansion, now a private residence with a completely overhauled security system, remains a landmark of a bygone era, its halls no longer echoing with the silent, unseen footsteps of a contract killer. For Detective Vane, now retired and living in the quiet suburbs of the state, the resolution of the Thorne case is the final, satisfying chapter of a career that spanned the analog and the digital ages of policing. He often walks past the old opera house and thinks of the millionaire who never saw his own end coming, and he finds peace in the knowledge that even in the darkest, most meticulously planned crimes, there is always a thread that leads back to the truth, and a detective waiting on the other side to pull it until the entire fabric unravels. The investigation into Julian Thorne's murder was not a sprint. It was a grueling, decades-long marathon through the dark alleys of corporate greed and the impenetrable silence of the ultra-wealthy. In the immediate aftermath of the December 1999 discovery, the Buckhead precinct became a pressure cooker of professional anxiety and civic outrage. The initial forensic sweep of the study, while frustratingly devoid of fingerprints, provided the homicide squad with their first, haunting glimpse into the killer's psychological landscape. They discovered a single, microscopic residue of a substance that defied standard chemical analysis at the time, a synthetic paralytic that acted with surgical precision, stopping the heart without triggering a massive adrenaline dump. It was the calling card of someone who had practiced the mechanics of death in laboratories far removed from the messy realities of street crime. Detective Marcus Vane, then a rising star in the precinct, spent his nights staring at the layout of the Thorne Manor, obsessing over the 3-minute security camera glitch that had served as the assassin's operational window. He knew that the killer wasn't just a hitman. They were a tactician, someone who had mapped the manor's electronic blind spots as if they were blueprints for a heist. The local media frenzy in early 2000 was a relentless, pulsating beast that refused to let the case slip into the shadows. News anchors with serious expressions grilled the police chief on live television, demanding to know how a man of Thorne's stature could be liquidated in his own fortress. The mansion became a site of morbid tourism, with onlookers gathering at the wrought iron gates to snap photos, hoping to catch a glimpse of the investigators or the mysterious figures coming and going from the estate. Within the precinct, the atmosphere was fractured. Internal politics began to poison the investigation, with whispers circulating that Thorne had been involved in illicit satellite technology deals that attracted the attention of federal agencies. There were rumors of black-budget operations, anonymous phone calls to the captain's desk from men with distorted voices, and a sudden, inexplicable tightening of access to Thorne's private financial records by his own legal team. Vane felt the walls closing in, not just from the pressure of the case, but from the institutional forces that seemed determined to ensure the truth remained buried under a mountain of non-disclosure agreements. The search for the architect, a name that had surfaced in the underground chatter of the city's criminal underworld shortly after the murder, became Vane's white whale. He spent his off-duty hours trawling the smoke-filled basements of midtown bars, trading favors with informants who were usually the first to know when a big-time player had been removed from the board. He heard whispers of a man who traveled under a dozen aliases, a shadow figure who operated with a refined, intellectual detachment, a man who saw killing as a task of structural engineering, where the victim was merely a component to be removed from the equation. This was the era before smartphones, before social media, and before the digital sprawl had made it impossible for a man to truly disappear. Vane learned that this killer left no digital trail, no photographs, and, most maddeningly, no partners who lived long enough to talk. He was a vacuum in the ecosystem of crime, and as Vane followed the leads from Atlanta to New York, and finally to the sterile, gray industrial centers of the Pacific Northwest, he realized he was chasing a man who had mastered the art of being invisible. By 2005, the Thorne case had been officially downgraded, shifted to the back corner of the cold case unit's filing cabinet, but for Vane, it had become a permanent resident of his consciousness. He kept a personal ledger, a thick, leather-bound book containing the names of everyone Thorne had spoken to in the final 48 hours of his life, the financial records of his telecommunications empire, and the flight manifests of every private jet that had left the Atlanta airfield on the night of the murder. He began to see patterns that the original task force had dismissed as statistical noise, a consistent frequency of offshore wires, a specific shipping firm that kept appearing in the background of Thorne's most controversial mergers, and the recurring presence of a cryptic, encrypted signal that had bypassed the Thorne estate's main servers exactly 1 hour before the camera glitch. Vane was beginning to realize that Thorne's murder wasn't just a hit, it was a hostile takeover carried out with a blade instead of a board vote. The tragedy of the situation was amplified by the silence of the Thorne family. His wife, a woman who seemed more concerned with the protection of the estate's stock valuation than the identity of her husband's killer, had been a brick wall of corporate decorum from day one. She had cleared out the study, hired private cleaners, and had the room painted a soft, neutral beige within a week of the funeral, effectively erasing the final scene of the crime before the forensic teams had even finished their second pass. Vane often wondered if she knew more than she was letting on, if the hit had been a mercy killing of a marriage or a necessary disposal of a husband who had become too dangerous to his own interests. She eventually moved to London, marrying a venture capitalist, and for years, she was a ghost in Vane's investigation, a woman who had successfully pivoted away from the wreckage of the Thorne tragedy as if it were a bad stock trade. As the years drifted toward 2010, the limitations of the era's forensic technology began to act as a tether on Vane's ambitions. He sent the whiskey glass, the hair samples, and the fibers from the study to laboratories across the country, but the results always came back with the same devastating note: insufficient material. The science of the time was a blunt instrument, and he was trying to perform brain surgery with it. He spent his late-night hours in the precinct listening to the hum of the servers, imagining the secrets trapped in those outdated hard drives, knowing that the proof he needed was sitting right in front of him, hidden in a layer of digital code that no one in the room knew how to decipher. He was a man out of time, living in the space between the analog world he was trained for and the digital future that was already starting to rewrite the rules of criminal science. The personal cost of the obsession was profound. Vane's marriage, stretched thin by the late-night stakeouts and the relentless, brooding silence he brought home from the precinct, finally fractured in 2012. He found himself sitting in a quiet, lonely apartment, the Thorne files spread out on the dining table, realizing that he had prioritized a dead millionaire over the living members of his own family. But there was no turning back. He had become part of the case's architecture, a structural component of the mystery itself. He decided to leave the force, but not the hunt. He took a position as a private consultant for the insurance firms that were still paying out on the massive, contested life insurance policies tied to Thorne's death, using his deep-seated knowledge of the files to continue the investigation under the guise of corporate risk assessment. He spent the next few years traveling, following the trail of offshore accounts and shell companies that he had identified years earlier. He learned that the hit had been commissioned through a series of intermediaries, a convoluted path of payments that looped through 3 different continents before landing in a secure, anonymous trust in the Cayman Islands. He tracked the money until it vanished into a series of dummy firms, realizing that the killer had been paid not in cash, but in equity, the very stock that Thorne had been trying to protect. The realization was sickening. The hit had been financed by the company itself, a self-cannibalizing act of corporate survival that Thorne hadn't realized was underway until he was sitting in his leather chair, watching the assassin pour him a glass of water. The final realization that came to Vane in 2019 was that he wasn't looking for a lone assassin, but for an entire organization. The architect wasn't just a man. He was a service, a black market utility provided by a shadowy conglomerate that specialized in the orderly removal of business rivals. The hit on Thorne had been a proof of concept, a test run for a system that would eventually handle high-level disappearances and political liquidations all over the world. The investigation had moved from the realm of homicide into the realm of global statecraft, and Vane felt a surge of terrifying realization. If he continued to pull at this thread, he wasn't just risking his own life. He was threatening the security of individuals who could move markets and change governments. Yet, despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, he felt a strange, cold clarity. He was no longer a detective trying to catch a killer. He was a man trying to pull the curtain back on a machine. He spent the pandemic years in isolation, surrounded by stacks of paper and the rapidly evolving software that allowed him to visualize the complex connections of the financial networks he had been tracking for 2 decades. He had become a master of digital cartography, mapping the secret routes through which money flowed from the Thorne estate to the hands of the killer. He was mapping the hidden history of the early 21st century, realizing that the story of Julian Thorne was just the first, blood-stained page in a larger, darker narrative of institutionalized violence. By 2025, the technology finally caught up to his resolve. He saw the headlines about the success of genetic genealogy in solving the Golden State Killer case and the cold case breakthroughs in California, and he felt a sudden, electric pulse of anticipation. He knew it was finally time. He reached out to his old contacts in the Atlanta Cold Case Squad, presenting them not with theories, but with a digitized, color-coded map of the Thorne execution that was so precise it could only be ignored by a department that was actively trying to look the other way. The wheels started to turn again, not with the sluggish, bureaucratic motion of the 90s, but with the high-speed, data-driven certainty of the modern era. The hunt was coming back to life, and this time, the man who had been the architect of death was not going to be able to hide behind the shadows of his corporate masters. Vane looked at the name he had finally uncovered in the depths of the financial records, the true, legal identity of the man who had walked into the Thorne study, and he knew that the ghost was about to lose its sanctuary. The silence of the Thorne study, once a vacuum of unanswered questions, began to fill with the cold, hard data of the 21st century. Detective Marcus Vane, standing in the Modern Precinct's high-tech command center, watched as the digital forensic team projected a labyrinth of financial transactions onto the massive wall-mounted screens. This was the long-awaited payoff for decades of obsessive cataloging, the offshore accounts, the shell companies, and the untraceable wire transfers that Vane had once mapped by hand in his lonely dining room were now dancing in a vivid, interconnected web of modern data visualization. The trail led directly from Thorne's telecommunications conglomerate, a monolithic entity that had spent the early 2000s absorbing competitors and gutting its own internal governance, to a sequence of intermediary accounts that finally deposited into a private, high-security trust based in the Pacific Northwest. The team noticed a peculiar, recurring signature in the financial records, a series of fractional, automated payments labeled as maintenance consulting, that occurred on the 15th day of every month for a decade following Thorne's death. This wasn't merely payment for a hit, it was a salary. Julian Thorne's killers were still on the company payroll, a permanent, hidden line item in a budget that ran into the billions. The data pointed to an individual who had operated under the name Arthur Penhaligon, a name that, upon deeper investigation, appeared to be a masterpiece of bureaucratic fabrication, a ghost identity constructed with the kind of clearance that only a high-level government or corporate entity could provide. Vane realized with a jolt of chilling clarity that this wasn't just a corporate hit, It was a state-sanctioned removal, a project where the boundaries between law enforcement, defense contracting, and private capital had completely eroded. The search for Penhaligon transitioned into a high-stakes game of digital surveillance. The team deployed a sophisticated, AI-driven behavioral analysis tool designed to track the digital footprint of retired, high-security operatives who lived off the grid. They looked for the telltale signs of a man who had been trained to avoid detection but was forced to interact with the modern world. The online grocery delivery to a specific suburban location, the infrequent, encrypted logins to a secure banking portal from a consistent, high-speed IP address in the Seattle metropolitan area, and the suspicious, recurring activity on a high-end avian photography forum. It was the birdwatching interest that provided the ultimate, humanizing mistake, a profile under the username EagleWatcher99 that featured photos of the same rare species of raptor that Penhaligon had been spotted watching in his neighborhood years earlier. The digital trail had been verified. The killer was found. Detective Vane, now officially the lead consultant on the task force, felt the familiar, acidic surge of adrenaline he had first experienced in the Buckhead study 27 years prior. He coordinated with the Seattle field office, laying out the tactical plan with the precision of a military commander. They couldn't simply kick down the door. They needed to ensure that Penhaligon was caught with enough evidence to secure a conviction, and they had to be absolutely certain that the agency wouldn't step in to extract their asset. The plan was built around the principle of overwhelming, undeniable legal force, a comprehensive seizure of all digital hardware, financial records, and physical evidence that could link Penhaligon to the architect persona. Vane flew to Seattle under an alias, his heart pounding in his chest as he stood in the cold, misty air of the airport, knowing that he was finally about to come face-to-face with the man who had turned his life into a decades-long pursuit of ghosts. The surveillance team's observation post was a cramped, nondescript apartment across the street from Penhaligon's residence, a place where Vane spent hours watching the man through the lens of a long-range thermal camera. Arthur Penhaligon was a frail, unassuming figure in his mid-70s, his hair thin, his gait slow and deliberate, a man who spent his afternoons tending to his garden and his evenings sitting on his porch, observing the birds with a pair of professional-grade binoculars. He showed no signs of the cold-blooded predator who had injected Thorne with a paralytic agent in a Buckhead study. He looked like any other retired veteran living a quiet, unremarkable life in the Pacific Northwest. It was the most disturbing aspect of the case, the utter, unrepentant normalcy of a man who had built a career on the quiet removal of human beings from the board. The realization that they were going to arrest a man who might be suffering from early-stage memory loss or cardiovascular decline added a layer of profound tension to the mission. The legal team worried that a jury would look at Penhaligon and see only a grandfather, not the architect of the Thorne assassination. Vane, however, remained unmoved. He knew that the lethality of a man like Penhaligon did not reside in his physical strength, but in his methodology, a clinical, structural, and intellectual approach to violence that was as lethal at 75 as it had been at 40. He urged the team to focus on the digital evidence, the logs, the encryption keys, and the financial records that proved his continuous, multi-decade role as an operative for the shadowy conglomerate. The physical act of murder in 1999 was the centerpiece, but the ongoing maintenance of his consulting role was the glue that would hold the conviction together. The night before the arrest, Vane sat alone in the observation apartment, the city of Seattle glimmering like a sea of diamonds in the distance. He pulled out his old, leather-bound notebook, the one that had survived 3 decades of wear, tear, and the slow, grinding process of the investigation. He flipped through the pages, seeing the names of suspects long dead, the financial maps that had led to dead ends, and the sheer, relentless commitment of a younger version of himself. He realized that the case had been a process of evolution, not just of technology, but of the investigator himself. He had started as a man looking for a killer, and he was ending as a man looking for the truth behind the machines of power that controlled the world. The Thorne case was the mirror in which he had seen his own growth, his own obsession, and ultimately, his own justification. The arrest itself was planned for 6 a.m., the hour when a human's cognitive defenses are at their lowest. Vane decided he would be part of the breach team. He needed to be the one to look into Penhaligon's eyes, to see if there was any flicker of recognition for the man who had spent 27 years hunting him. He reviewed the tactical briefing, the layout of the apartment, and the contingency plans one last time, his mind cycling through the potential traps. He knew that someone like Penhaligon would have a dead man switch, a way to transmit his sensitive data to his handlers if his life or liberty was threatened. The cyber warfare unit had spent weeks building a localized, high-frequency signal jammer to prevent any outgoing transmissions from the apartment the moment the door was breached. As he stood in the hallway of the apartment complex, the heavy tactical vest pressing against his chest, Vane heard the soft, distant sound of a clock chiming the hour. The silence in the hallway was absolute, a heavy, expectant void that seemed to swallow the breath of the waiting officers. He gripped the handle of his weapon, his knuckles white, and signaled the breach team. The door exploded open with a sound of rending wood and the flash of light, the team pouring into the apartment with the disciplined, coordinated energy of a single organism. Vane followed, his eyes sweeping the room, focusing on the figure in the center of the living room, an elderly man sitting in a leather chair, holding a cup of tea, his eyes fixed on the door with a calm, analytical curiosity. Penhaligon didn't reach for a weapon, didn't attempt to flee, and didn't shout. He simply sat there, his eyes locking onto Vane's, and for a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Vane could see the recognition in the man's eyes, not a fear of the law, but an acknowledgement of a fellow traveler who had finally arrived at the destination. It was the look of a craftsman seeing the hand of another, an appreciation for the sheer, grinding persistence required to map a path through 27 years of obfuscation. "You're late," Penhaligon whispered, his voice as dry as parchment, a faint, sardonic smile playing on his lips. "I thought you would have given up by the turn of the decade." Vane stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs, and held up the handcuffs. The architect of the Thorn murder, the man who had walked through the fire and the fog, was finally in custody, and the long, cold winter of the Atlanta cold case had finally begun to thaw. The air inside the Seattle apartment was not filled with the chaotic, adrenaline-fueled shouting that usually accompanies a high-stakes arrest. Instead, it was permeated by a cold, clinical stillness. Detective Marcus Vane stood over Arthur Penhaligon, his breath ragged, his eyes searching the face of the man who had been the architect of his career's greatest obsession. Penhaligon, despite the tactical team looming over him with weapons drawn, remained seated, his hands resting on the armrests of his armchair, his expression one of polite, almost weary, resignation. He looked like nothing more than a retired academic, a man who had spent his life in quiet study, and the contrast between that image and the reality of his lethal history was profoundly, sickeningly jarring. Vane moved closer, his handcuffs ready, and the silence in the room seemed to deepen, amplifying the sound of the team's gear and the distant, muffled sirens beginning to wail on the street below. "Arthur Penhaligon," Vane said, his voice struggling to maintain its professional cadence, "you are under arrest for the murder of Julian Thorn in Atlanta, Georgia. Do not move, and do not attempt to access any electronic devices." Penhaligon looked up at him, and for the first time, the facade of the frail old man shifted. His eyes, clear and unnervingly perceptive, locked onto Vane's with a cold, analytical intensity that suggested he was already evaluating the detective's tactical errors, his psychological vulnerabilities, and the inevitable systemic failures that would come with his prosecution. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply held out his wrists, the movement practiced and smooth, as if he had anticipated this specific moment of surrender for over a decade. The click of the steel cuffs as they closed around his arms was a sound that seemed to reverberate through Vane's entire body, marking the end of a hunt that had defined nearly 3 decades of his life. The tactical team began their work with a methodical, brutal efficiency, turning the apartment inside out in search of the evidence Vane knew had to exist: the servers, the ledger books, the encrypted drives that contained the history of the Thorn hit, and the hundreds of other contracts Penhaligon had fulfilled for the shadowy conglomerate he served. They found the hard drives hidden inside a lead-lined casing in the floorboards of the bedroom, a secure, electromagnetically shielded cache that held the complete, terrifying archive of his career. As the lead technician pulled the drives from their hiding place, Penhaligon's expression finally flickered, a momentary, sharp look of genuine defeat crossing his face before it vanished back into the calm, placid sea of his retirement persona. It wasn't the loss of his freedom that bothered him, it was the loss of the information, the erasure of the history he had spent his life meticulously recording. The transport from Seattle back to Atlanta was conducted under a level of security usually reserved for heads of state. Penhaligon sat in the back of the armored transport, flanked by 2 armed federal marshals, staring out the reinforced glass at the blurring, passing landscape of the American Northwest. He remained largely silent for the entire journey, answering only the most essential questions with a clipped, precise, and entirely noncommittal tone. Vane, seated across from him, watched him constantly, trying to discern if the man was suffering from remorse or if he was simply waiting, as he had always waited, for the next instruction. Vane realized that Penhaligon wasn't just a killer. He was a component, a part of a larger, systemic architecture of violence, and the man likely viewed his arrest as nothing more than a standard, expected operational failure. When they touched down at the Atlanta airfield, the humidity of the Georgia summer hit them like a physical blow, a stark, suffocating reminder of the world they had returned to. The media was already waiting in a dense, buzzing mob at the edge of the tarmac, their cameras and microphones forming a wall of light and noise that greeted Penhaligon's exit from the plane. The old man shielded his face, not from the cameras, but from the heat, his movements slow and deliberate as he was escorted into a secure vehicle that would carry him directly to the high-security detention center. Vane watched the spectacle, the flashing lights and the roar of the crowd, feeling a strange, hollow sense of unreality. For 27 years, he had imagined this moment as a climax, a definitive explosion of truth, yet in the quiet reality of the airfield, it felt more like a transition, a move from one set of shadows into another. The interrogation room was a stark, windowless box, designed to exert a psychological pressure that Penhaligon had evidently trained his mind to resist. Vane entered with a digital forensic report, the decrypted content of the Seattle hard drives, and placed the stack of papers on the table between them. He didn't speak. He just started reading aloud the names of the board members, the dates of the offshore transfers, and the specifics of the maintenance schedule that had governed the conglomerate's operations for decades. As Vane read, the air in the room seemed to shift, the arrogance that Penhaligon had maintained beginning to crack under the weight of the undeniable, physical record of his life's work. The man wasn't just being convicted of the Thorn murder. He was being confronted by the complete, systemic exposure of his organization, and for the first time, he looked truly, deeply afraid. "You think you've uncovered a conspiracy," Penhaligon whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden, sharp clarity. "But you've only uncovered a business model. Thorn wasn't killed because he was an enemy. He was killed because he was a liability, an inefficient part of a system that prioritizes stability above all else. You think you've arrested the architect, detective, but you haven't even looked at the foundation. They aren't going to let you testify. They aren't going to let this evidence see the inside of a courtroom." Vane felt a surge of cold, white-hot fury. He leaned over the table, his face inches from Penhaligon's, his voice a low, guttural growl that betrayed his years of pent-up, unresolved anger. "They can try," Vane said. "But the foundation is already crumbling. Your digital record is all the evidence we need to bring the whole structure down, and you're going to be the one who opens the door." The process of building the case against the conglomerate, the men who had actually ordered the hit, was a grueling, bureaucratic nightmare. Vane found himself battling not just the defense attorneys, but the hidden, soft power influence of a network that operated within the highest levels of the American political and economic system. Documents went missing from secure archives, witnesses were intimidated into silence, and Vane himself was subjected to a systematic, professional character assassination, with leaked reports questioning his mental state, his history with the Thorn case, and his obsession with Penhaligon. It was a war of attrition, a fight that moved from the concrete reality of the interrogation room to the abstract, invisible battlefield of corporate, legal, and political power. Vane realized that the Thorn murder was merely the tip of a terrifying, iceberg-sized conspiracy a reality that threatened to rewrite the history of the Atlanta corporate boom in blood. But Vane had one advantage: the digital history. The files he had seized in Seattle weren't just evidence of the Thorn hit. They were the central server logs for a decade of high-level consulting services provided to some of the most powerful entities in the world. He started leaking fragments of the evidence to carefully vetted, high-level investigative journalists at the national level, creating a public record that couldn't be destroyed by internal police pressure or the influence of the conglomerate. He was turning the case into a global news event, forcing the hands of the authorities by making it impossible for them to dismiss the evidence without being complicit in the cover-up. He was using the same digital tactics he had been investigating to force the hand of the powerful, creating a cascade of pressure that made the prosecution of Penhaligon and his handlers an unavoidable, high-priority mandate. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation took on a life of its own, the pressure building until it reached the point of no return. The grand jury indictments began to fall, one by one, targeting the members of the board who had voted for Thorn's removal, the bank executives who had facilitated the offshore payments, and the shadowy government contractors who had provided the resources for the maintenance consulting hit. The case was no longer just about Julian Thorn. It was about the corruption of an entire ecosystem of power. Vane, once a lone wolf hunting a shadow, had become the catalyst for a systemic, top-to-bottom cleansing of an institution that had operated with total impunity since the turn of the century. The courtroom, when the hearings finally began, was a theater of truth, a place where the carefully constructed myths of corporate meritocracy were dismantled, piece by piece, under the unblinking, relentless gaze of the law. And yet, in the midst of it all, Vane felt a haunting, persistent sense of distance. He watched Penhaligon sit in the defendant's chair, a frail, withered man who had been the most lethal entity in Atlanta for 30 years, and he realized that the man was already a relic. The world that had empowered Penhaligon, the world that had viewed Thorn as a liability to be erased, was changing in ways that even the most advanced corporate strategists couldn't predict. He was watching the death of an era, a final, bloody spasm of the old guard before the new, digital, transparent reality took hold. He sat in the back of the courtroom, his hands clasped, the old leather notebook tucked into his jacket pocket, and he felt the profound, quiet weight of a mission reaching its final, inevitable end. He had pulled the thread, and the entire fabric was unraveling, but the cost, the 13 years of isolation, the lost relationships, the toll on his own soul, was a price he could never fully calculate. The architect was in chains, the corporation was in ruins, and for Julian Thorn, for the first time in 27 years, there was finally, definitively, justice. The courtroom in Atlanta was a stifling crucible of history, a place where the air seemed thick with the dust of 1999, the year the Thorn legacy was frozen in time. As the trial of Arthur Penhaligon, the man who would eventually be known to the world as the architect of a corporate slaughter, entered its third week, the atmosphere reached a pitch of intensity that had not been seen in the Georgia justice system for a generation. The gallery was a packed, discordant ensemble of surviving family members, curious onlookers, and the very titans of industry whose own secret, blood-stained pasts were now being whispered into the public record. Detective Vane, seated in the front row, watched Penhaligon through the crystalline clarity of the courtroom's lighting. The old man, once a ghost, now seemed like a fragile, parchment-skinned artifact of a darker time, yet his eyes remained sharp, alert, and entirely devoid of the remorse that the prosecution and the families so desperately craved. The prosecution's case was a masterwork of digital and physical forensics, an algorithmic reconstruction of a crime that had once been considered the perfect hit. They presented the jury with the reconstructed financial ledgers, the high-resolution maps of the Thorn estate's security infrastructure, and the chilling, step-by-step forensic analysis of the paralytic substance that had been used to end Julian Thorn's life. Every piece of evidence was meticulously catalogued, a jigsaw puzzle that had taken Vane and his task force the better part of a year to assemble. But the true power of the state's argument lay not in the forensics, But in the testimony of the internal whistleblowers, the former corporate lieutenants and offshore bankers who had finally been granted immunity to turn on the conglomerate that had once controlled their livelihoods. Their stories, delivered in low, trembling voices, painted a portrait of a board of directors that operated less like a business and more like a syndicate, using the architect as their personal eraser for any liability that threatened their profit margins. Throughout the proceedings, Penhaligon remained an inscrutable figure. He did not provide a defense. He did not offer an explanation. He sat in silence, his hands clasped, a living statue of a man who had long ago transcended the petty human need for justification. Yet, in the rare moments when he would glance toward the prosecution, there was a flash of something unrecognizable, a cold, analytical appraisal of the very system that was now tearing his world apart. He looked at Vane not with hatred, but with a strange, lingering professional respect, as if acknowledging the detective's success in navigating a maze that had been designed to stay closed forever. It was a silent, psychological duel that spanned the width of the room, a recognition between the hunter and the hunted that had transcended the law and entered the realm of the existential. The turning point of the trial arrived with the entry of the digital evidence, the maintenance logs that Vane had discovered in the hidden server partitions. When the prosecutors projected the monthly payment schedules onto the massive courtroom monitors, the gallery erupted into a stunned, collective gasp. It was not just the Thorn hit. The records detailed a decade-long catalog of removals, minor competitors, whistleblowing employees, and inconvenient spouses, all categorized with a detached, sterile language of corporate efficiency. The jury members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock, then to a hardened, righteous anger. The architect was no longer an isolated, mythical figure. He was an institutional service, a department of death that had been authorized, funded, and protected by the pillars of Atlanta's corporate and political elite. The revelation sent a literal shiver through the room, the realization dawning on everyone that the murder of Julian Thorn was merely the most visible stitch in a tapestry of high-level homicide that had been allowed to operate in total impunity. Defense counsel, despite their exorbitant fees and the weight of the corporate influence behind them, began to fold under the relentless, cascading evidence. They attempted to claim that Penhaligon was merely a consultant, a man who provided security services for high-risk assets and had no control over how his clients interpreted his work, but the digital evidence of his direct, hands-on involvement in the Thorn hit was impossible to circumvent. They were fighting against a ghost who had finally been forced into the daylight, and the sunlight was proving to be entirely too bright. Vane watched as the defense's confidence eroded, the lawyers becoming increasingly desperate, their motions being denied with a surgical, dismissive regularity by a judge who seemed to understand that the trial was about more than just one man. It was about the integrity of the law itself against the unchecked power of the modern corporation. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, Vane felt a nagging, persistent sense of unease. He kept thinking back to Penhaligon's whispered warning in the interrogation room. You think you've uncovered a conspiracy, but you've only uncovered a business model. He knew that the conglomerate, the men who had actually approved the hit, the board members who had signed the checks, and the government contractors who had provided the resources, were still, for the most part, safely ensconced in their executive suites. Penhaligon was the architect, but he was also the fall guy. He was the asset being sacrificed to ensure the survival of the entity. Vane started to dig deeper, even as the trial progressed, spending his nights combing through the financial data he had already scrutinized 100 times. He was looking for the one thing Penhaligon had tried to protect, the primary dead man switch, a cache of data that could potentially drag the entire system down with the architect. He found it in a corrupted, encrypted partition within the primary drive of the Seattle hardware, a hidden file that hadn't been decrypted by the initial forensic team. It wasn't a log, it was a digital confession, a personal archive that Penhaligon had been building as his own form of insurance. It contained not just the names, but the recordings, the transcripts of the board meetings, and the high-resolution scans of the signed contracts that explicitly authorized the Thorn hit. It was the foundation Penhaligon had alluded to, the complete, systematic blueprint of the organization's criminal history. Vane sat in his office at the precinct, the early morning light filtering through the blinds, and read through the file with a feeling of awe. This was it. This was the key to unlocking the entire corrupt structure, the record that would ensure that even if Penhaligon was the one in the defendant's chair, his handlers would eventually follow him into the prison system. He contacted the lead prosecutor, handing over the digital drive with a sense of grim, necessary duty. The shift in the courtroom the following day was instantaneous. As the recordings were played, the voice of the then CEO of Thorne's company, a man who is now a prominent, philanthropic senator, filled the courtroom, discussing the logistics of the Thorne situation with a calm, predatory indifference that made the hair on the back of Vane's neck stand up. The trial became less a defense of Penhaligon and more a comprehensive, systemic takedown of the entire network. The senator was forced to resign within hours. The board of the conglomerate was dissolved by a court-ordered receiver, and the investigation expanded to encompass a dozen other active cases. The Architect trial had transformed into a national reckoning, a moment where the veil of corporate secrecy had been torn away, revealing the dark, beating heart of a system that had traded blood for stock options for over a quarter of a century. In the final days of the evidentiary phase, Vane watched Penhaligon from the gallery one last time. The old man looked smaller, more diminished, his presence fading as the narrative of the case shifted away from him and toward the powerful men who had commissioned his work. But Penhaligon's eyes, when they locked onto Vane's one last time, weren't filled with regret or anger. They were filled with a strange, serene satisfaction. He had lost his freedom, he had lost his anonymity, but he had managed to trigger the very collapse he had spent his life preventing. By being caught, he had forced the Architect's system to face its own internal contradiction, and in his own, twisted way, he had ensured that his work would be remembered, even if only as the catalyst for the system's own implosion. As the jury finally retired to deliberate, Vane walked out of the courtroom and into the humid, sweltering Atlanta afternoon. The city felt different. The bustle, the traffic, the gleaming skyscrapers of the telecommunications district all seemed to vibrate with a new, sharper reality. The myth of the perfect crime, the myth of the untouchable executive, and the myth of the untraceable hitman had all been dissolved. He looked up at the glass monoliths, knowing that for the first time in nearly 30 years, the shadows were empty. The hunt was over, the foundation was exposed, and Julian Thorne, a man who had been a symbol of everything that was wrong with the era, had finally received the cold, hard justice that had been denied to him on that winter night in 1999. The story of the Architect would be the final, indelible stain on the corporate history of the city, a lesson that in the digital age, the truth has a way of becoming inescapable, relentless, and eventually total. The jury's deliberation in the case of the People versus Arthur Penhaligon lasted a mere 4 hours, a fleeting window of time that, for Detective Marcus Vane, felt like an eternity compressed into the ticking of a courthouse clock. The silence that descended upon the courtroom when the bailiff announced the return of the verdict was absolute, a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to drain the oxygen from the room. As the jurors filed back into their places, their faces were masked, providing no hint of the storm of moral and legal reckoning they had just navigated. Vane sat in the front row, his hands gripped so tightly on his knees that his knuckles turned white, his breath hitching as the foreperson rose to deliver the final word on a case that had dominated his consciousness since the final days of the 20th century. Guilty, the foreperson stated, the word ringing out like a gavel strike against the soul of the city. On all counts, conspiracy to commit murder, first-degree premeditated assassination, and the formation of a criminal enterprise. The courtroom did not erupt in cheers. Instead, it fell into a stunned, collective exhale, a sound of release for a community that had lived under the shadow of a phantom for 27 years. Arthur Penhaligon remained motionless, his head slightly bowed, his hands folded in his lap, as if he were attending a lecture rather than hearing his own life sentence being prepared. He was the architect of his own destruction, a man whose life had been dedicated to the engineering of silence, now standing in the center of a roar of truth. Vane watched him, feeling a strange, hollow sensation of victory. The ghost was caught, The man who had been the instrument of a corporate god was now a prisoner of the state, and the file that had occupied his desk, his nightstand, and his dreams for nearly 3 decades was finally moving from active to closed. The sentencing phase, held 2 weeks later, was a masterclass in the cold, hard mathematics of justice. The prosecution presented the victims' impact statements, a long, harrowing list of families whose lives had been upended by the conglomerate's maintenance schedule. The courtroom was filled with the ghosts of the 99, the junior partners, the inconvenient whistleblowers, and the rivals who had vanished into the same fog that had swallowed Julian Thorne. As the judge delivered the life sentence, she spoke of the fragility of truth in an age of corporate excess and how the persistence of one investigator had eventually pierced the armor of an entire organization. Vane listened, but his mind was on the broader implication. The system had worked, but it had only worked because the data survived. He realized that the era of the perfect crime had come to a definitive end, killed by the very technology that had once been used to facilitate the deception. Inside the detention facility, the transition for Penhaligon was absolute. He was moved from the holding cell to the permanent, maximum security isolation unit, his world shrinking from the vast, global web of the architect to a 9-by-9-foot room of concrete and steel. The prison administration viewed him as a Tier 1 asset, a man whose knowledge of the conglomerate's remaining off-the-books operations made him a target for both law enforcement and the very people who had once signed his paychecks. His days were silent, punctuated only by the clatter of food trays and the rhythmic, hollow thud of guards patrolling the corridor. He was no longer a consultant. He was a relic of a time before the digital age, a man who had been outpaced by the evolution of the truth. He spent his time in the yard, staring at the sky, his mind likely retracing the steps he had taken to remove Thorne, analyzing where the system had failed and where he had, ultimately, been the catalyst of his own unmasking. The corporate fallout of the trial was immediate and catastrophic for the network that had protected Penhaligon. The conglomerate, once a titan of the Atlanta telecommunications boom, declared bankruptcy as the federal indictments began to pile up, its assets seized and its leadership arrested in a cascade of handcuffs. The philanthropic senator who had been the architect of the board's decisions was stripped of his office, his legacy replaced by a criminal record that would be studied for its audacity and its ultimate, pathetic collapse. The network that had operated with total impunity was being dismantled, branch by branch, by a task force that utilized the same digital mapping tools Vane had used to track Penhaligon. The collapse of a system was total, a house of cards that had finally met the wind of a transparent, data-driven society. Detective Vane, in the weeks following the verdict, found himself wandering the halls of the precinct, the quiet hum of the servers now sounding like a symphony of order rather than a cryptic, untouchable mystery. He was approached by the department's leadership to take the lead on a new, permanent, institutional cold case division, a role that would allow him to train others in the methodologies he had pioneered. He turned the offer down not because he was finished, but because he was finally ready to be something other than an investigator. He realized that the pursuit of the architect had been a form of exile, a self-imposed isolation that had kept him from the rest of the world. He started the process of selling his apartment, of reaching out to the family he had neglected, and of finally learning how to live in a world where the shadows no longer held the answers he was constantly hunting. The final, definitive moment of the case for Vane came on a rainy Tuesday in late autumn. He returned to the site of the Thorne Manor, now a modernized, private estate, and stood at the edge of the property, looking toward the study windows that had been completely renovated since the night of the hit. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and dead leaves, the same scent it had carried on that night in 1999. He pulled out the old leather notebook for the last time, the pages thin and worn, the ink fading at the edges. He sat on the stone wall and read the final entry he had written. The architect is caught. The machine is broken. The truth is restored. He closed the book, felt the weight of it in his hand, and realized that it no longer felt like a burden. He stood up and tucked the book into the trash bin at the entrance of the park, a simple, final, and necessary act of closure. The city of Atlanta, moving forward with its relentless, vibrant energy, had begun to turn the page. The Thorne murder was no longer a headline. It was a footnote, an entry in the history of the city's forensic transformation. The digital tools that had solved the mystery were now the standard, the protocol that ensured the safety of the citizens, and the shield against the return of the kind of unchecked corporate violence that had once flourished in the 90s. Vane stood at the corner of the street, watching the traffic flow by, the lights of the skyscrapers in the distance twinkling with the promise of a city that had faced its worst impulses and had, in the process, become more resilient, more accountable, and more aware. The architect of death was behind bars, the system was dismantled, and for Marcus Vane, the ghost of 1999 was finally at rest. In the months that followed, the detective's departure from the force was a quiet, almost non-event. He left his badge on the desk of his captain, took his few personal belongings, and walked out of the precinct into the bright, morning light. There were no press conferences, no farewell parties, and no dramatic announcements. He was a man who had dedicated his life to a singular, consuming mystery, and now that it was solved, he was simply and profoundly free. He spent his first week of retirement in a small cabin in the North Georgia mountains, miles away from the digital noise and the relentless pace of the city. For the first time in nearly 30 years, he did not wake up thinking about the Thorn study, the security glitches, or the identity of the architect. He woke up to the sound of the wind, the rustle of the trees, and the simple, peaceful reality of a world that didn't need to be solved. The legacy of the Arthur Penhaligon trial would live on, not in the memory of the murder, but in the memory of the investigation, in the way that it forced the law to evolve, in the way it demanded the integration of digital and physical evidence, and in the way it proved that even the most well-funded, well-protected systems of control are eventually subject to the gravitational pull of the truth. Vane was no longer a detective, but he was a witness to the evolution of justice, a man who had been a part of the transition from an era of silence to an era of total accountability. He lived his life in the quiet, mountain air, his days filled with the simple, restorative tasks of a man who had finally earned his peace. The ghost of Julian Thorne, the phantom of the architect, and the shadow of the 90s were all, finally, relegated to the pages of history, leaving behind a city and a society that could finally look toward the future without the fear of what might be waiting for them in the dark. As the years began to pass, the story of the Atlanta cold case became a legend, a story that parents told their children about the importance of integrity and that detectives told their recruits about the importance of persistence. The name of the architect was whispered not as a source of terror, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder that in the modern age, the most powerful weapon is not the gun or the money, but the truth itself, written in the indelible, unchangeable record of digital history. And somewhere, in the mountains of Georgia, Marcus Vane would occasionally look down at the city in the distance, seeing the glow of the lights, and he would smile, a soft, quiet, and genuine smile of a man who had not only solved the mystery, but had, in the process, reclaimed his own life. The case was closed, the records were sealed, and the story of the Atlanta cold case had finally, perfectly concluded. The incarceration of Arthur Penhaligon, the man the world had learned to call the architect, was not merely a logistical transition for the Georgia Department of Corrections, it was the symbolic dismantling of a titan. As the summer of 2026 transitioned into an unusually sweltering autumn, the high-security facility housing him became a focal point of sociological study. The architect was no longer the phantom who could slip through 3-minute security gaps in the Buckhead Estates. He was a geriatric inmate, his movements monitored by motion sensors and his communications, every written note, every permitted phone call, scrutinized by a dedicated federal oversight committee. The facility, which had been designed to house the most dangerous elements of society, found itself managing a man whose danger had not been his ability to wield a weapon, but his ability to wield information as an instrument of assassination. His presence was an anomaly, a bridge between the analog brutality of the late 20th century and the clinical, data-driven criminality of the 21st. In the quiet, sanitized corridors of the isolation wing, Penhaligon became a recluse of the most profound variety. He refused the standard prison social dynamics, spending his waking hours in the small, austere day room or the library, often hunched over technical manuals or books on the history of telecommunications, as if he were trying to understand the very systems that had eventually betrayed him. The prison staff, instructed to maintain a policy of strictly enforced neutrality, found him to be a man of impeccable, if unsettling, politeness. He never complained, he never agitated, and he never asked for special privileges. He lived with the same terrifying level of professional discipline that he had applied to the Thorn hit. To the guards, he was not the monster of the front pages. He was a shadow who moved with an economy of motion that suggested he was always, in his own mind, still calculating the optimal exit strategy. Back in Atlanta, the institutional ripples of the conviction continued to transform the city's corporate and legal landscape. The Vance Miller Protocols, inspired by the broader movement of transparency that the Thorn trial had catalyzed, were now firmly integrated into the charter of every major corporation operating in the Southeast. Boardrooms that had once operated as closed circuits of mutual protection were now subjected to third-party digital audits, and the culture of the off-the-books liability removal, the very business model Penhaligon had been hired to maintain, was now treated as a high-risk criminal enterprise. The law had not just caught up to the architects of the world, it had fundamentally rewritten the architecture of the boardrooms they had once dominated. The city was finally, and decisively, moving past the 90s, a decade of unfettered, blood-stained ambition, and into a future where the ledger books were finally open to the light. Detective Marcus Vane, now living his life in the mountains of North Georgia, found that the silence of his retirement was the most difficult mystery he had ever had to solve. For 30 years, his identity had been inextricably linked to the Thorn file. His moods had been dictated by the ebb and flow of the investigation, his social circle had been limited to the precinct, and his sense of self-worth had been tethered to the eventual arrest of the architect. Now, with the case closed, the ghost of 1999 finally laid to rest, he had to grapple with the reality of being a man without a mission. He spent his days in the cabin, the mountain air acting as a natural balm for the years of stress and nocturnal pacing. He started a garden, he read the books he had ignored in his youth, and he occasionally sat on his porch, looking out toward the distant, hazy glow of Atlanta on the horizon, realizing that the city was doing just fine without his watchful, restless eye. The media's obsession with the architect case began to subside, replaced by a more nuanced, academic fascination. Documentaries were produced, podcasts dissected the digital forensics, and sociologists wrote papers on the Penhaligon phenomenon. The consensus among the experts was that the architect was a symptom of a specific, transitional moment in history, an era where corporate power had outstripped the capability of the traditional investigative tools of the time. The case was no longer just a crime story, it was an archaeology of the 90s, a way for the current generation to look back and understand why their parents had lived in a world where a millionaire could be killed in his own home, and the law could simply walk away. Vane, who was occasionally approached by producers and journalists, mostly turned them away. He knew that their desire for a narrative would never truly capture the cold, grinding, and often mundane reality of what it had meant to hunt a man through 3 decades of history. As the leaves began to turn in the autumn of 2026, the Thorn estate, the place where the architectural blueprint of death had been first laid down, underwent its final, public transformation. The current owners, fully aware of the mansion's history, decided to open the grounds for a community-led day of remembrance for the victims of the conglomerate's long-term cover-ups. It was a surreal, powerful scene, the pristine, velvet-lawned estate where deals were once brokered in blood now bustling with families, children playing on the grass, and a quiet, dignified memorial being erected at the edge of the property. Vane attended, not as a detective, but as a citizen, walking the grounds with a sense of detachment that he had never expected to feel. He saw the study, now repurposed as a home office, and he felt no lingering dread. The house had been reclaimed. The trauma had been absorbed and neutralized by the passage of time and the simple, persistent act of living. In the prison, the architect was visited once, and only once, by a representative of the state's forensic archive. The intent was not to gloat or to interrogate, but to confirm a small, technical discrepancy in the digital record of one of the earlier, unsolved hits. Penhaligon had been gracious, helpful, and entirely detached. He had pointed out the error, a simple, elegant piece of coding logic that the forensic team had misread, and had then returned to his chair, his eyes fixed on the distant, high-altitude horizon visible through the small, reinforced window. The representative had walked away with the feeling that they had not been speaking to a prisoner, but to a man who had already transcended his surroundings, a man who had long ago reached the logical conclusion of his own story and was simply waiting for the final, necessary entropy to set in. The broader forensic world had moved on to a new era of intelligence-driven policing. The Architect case was now the primary case study in how to handle nonlinear investigations, cases where the evidence is not gathered in a sequence, but discovered as a shifting, evolving pattern of metadata. The detectives who were entering the force in 2026 were being taught the Vane protocol, to prioritize the digital footprint over the physical, to view the suspect not as an individual but as a node in a network, and to recognize that in the modern world, nothing is ever truly deleted. The training programs were rigorous, focusing on the intersection of human behavior and algorithmic pattern analysis, ensuring that the next Arthur Penhaligon would never have the luxury of 27 years to exist in the shadows. Vane's own transition toward peace was bolstered by the arrival of the first snowfall in the mountains. He had always hated the winter in the city, the gray slush, the biting, industrial cold, the suffocating, claustrophobic feeling of the precinct, but in the mountains, the snow was different. It was a cleansing, a blank, silent slate that settled over the landscape, creating a world of profound, uninterrupted calm. He realized that the Thorn case had been a long, cold winter that had lasted for over half his life. He had been so obsessed with uncovering the truth beneath the frozen ground that he had forgotten to appreciate the seasons passing above him. Now, as the white blanket covered his garden, he sat by the fire, a cup of coffee in his hand, and he finally felt the thaw. He was no longer the detective, he was no longer the hunter, and for the first time, he was not looking for the truth in the archives. He was looking at the fire, at the hearth, at the quiet, beautiful, and profoundly simple reality of his own, singular life. The history of the Architect, once it was fully archived and the conglomerate was fully dissolved, had become a permanent part of the city's forensic tapestry. It was a story that would continue to be told, but it would no longer be a living, breathing threat. The Thorn murder would remain the most famous cold case in Atlanta's history, but it would finally be just that, a case from the past. The city had outlived the Architect, just as it had outlived the industrial rot of the 90s and the corruption of the corporate boom. It was a city that was perpetually renewing itself, layer by layer, and in that renewal, the tragedy of 1999 had finally been integrated, understood, and laid to rest. The mystery had been solved, the debt had been paid, and the Architect was now nothing more than a name on a file in a dark, dusty, and ultimately meaningless part of the record. And for the people who had lived through the hunt, the final, perfect conclusion was the realization that they were no longer looking for answers. They were finally, at last, just looking for each other. The architecture of silence that once defined the Thorn estate had been so absolute that, even after the conviction, the manor itself seemed to hold its breath. In the winter of 2026, the Buckhead district felt different. The high-powered, predatory atmosphere of the late 90s, that era of unchecked corporate aggression and shadow deals, had been replaced by a modern, sterile, and hyper-transparent urban environment. The legacy of Arthur Penhaligon, the man who had acted as the blade for an entire elite social class, had become the ghost in the machine of Atlanta's new, digital-first economy. As the city transitioned into the deep freeze of the year's end, the legal and social ramifications of the Architect's life sentence continued to permeate the corporate and social structures that had once sought to bury him. The high-security facility housing Penhaligon had evolved into a crucible of isolation. He had stopped asking for books, stopped interacting with the guards, and seemed to have retreated into a private, intellectual fortress of his own construction. The prison staff noted that he spent hours staring at the wall, his lips occasionally moving as if he were rerunning the simulations of his past, not in search of a different outcome, but in search of the flaw. He was an architect, and he was trying to understand why his most complex building had collapsed. The obsession that had driven his professional life, the need for total order, for the perfect removal of an obstacle, had now turned inward, manifesting as a meticulous, unending analysis of the digital evidence that Vane had eventually used to bring him down. He had become a man trapped in his own metadata, forever reliving the moment the screen of his life turned black. Across the country, the forensic communities and investigative bureaus were still feeling the shockwaves of the case. The Penhaligon effect had effectively ended the cold case era of the 90s. Departments that had once let files gather dust for decades were now undergoing massive digitization efforts, rescanning old paper archives, and utilizing the high-speed processing tools that Vane had pioneered to identify dormant patterns in long unsolved crimes. The case had provided the industry with a roadmap. It was no longer about the smoking gun or the bloody fingerprint. It was about the longitudinal analysis of institutional behavior. Investigators were now taught to look for the structural evidence, the way money moved, the way personnel were shuffled, the way administrative records were scrubbed, treating entire organizations as the primary suspect rather than an individual. Detective Marcus Vane, living out his retirement in the North Georgia mountains, found that his new life required a different kind of vigilance. He was no longer hunting for a killer, but he was constantly monitoring the horizon, watching how the world continued to change in the wake of the trial. He kept in touch with the cold case squad, not as an active member, but as a mentor, offering his perspective on the intersection of human psychology and systemic corruption. He found that his presence in the department was still felt. His legacy was the standard of the new office, a culture that refused to walk away from a mystery simply because it was old. He had taught them that the truth has a specific, immutable gravity, and that if you pull on the thread long enough, the entire system must eventually surrender its secrets. One afternoon, in the dying light of a late November sunset, Vane sat on his porch and watched the mountains turn a deep, bruising purple. He was visited by a young agent from the State Bureau who had been working on a case that shared some of the same procedural earmarks as the Thorne murder, a high-level executive disappearance from the early 2000s. Vane looked over the files, his eyes scanning the familiar patterns, the suspicious offshore wires, the silent security teams, the total administrative erasure. As he worked through the data, he realized that Penhaligon had not been an anomaly. He had been a practice run. There were others, other architects, other systems of disposal, that were still operating in the fringes of the global economy, hidden by the very same layer of corporate protection that had shielded Penhaligon for so long. The realization did not fill Vane with dread, but with a strange, tempered clarity. He realized that the Thorne case was not the end of the story. It was merely the first successful breach of a far larger, far more resilient fortress. He spent the evening detailing the patterns for the young agent, showing him how to look for the maintenance signatures, how to track the fractional, automated payments, and how to identify the subtle, administrative glitches that marked the involvement of a professional consultant. He was passing the torch, handing over the map of a dark, labyrinthine reality that he had spent his life trying to chart. For the first time in 30 years, he wasn't looking at the past. He was helping someone else prepare for the future. In the city of Atlanta, the Thorne mansion was finally sold to a new family, a young couple in the tech sector who were entirely unburdened by the history of the house. They renovated the study, replaced the leather chairs, and brought in bright, modern art, effectively scrubbing the last remnants of the 90s from the home. For the neighbors, the property was no longer a symbol of dread or a site of morbid curiosity. It was just a house, a place where people lived, worked, and grew old. The tragedy that had once defined the neighborhood had been successfully absorbed into the background noise of the city, neutralized by the mundane, rhythmic flow of daily life. The ghost of Julian Thorne had finally stopped haunting the halls, replaced by the laughter of a new generation that had no idea who the architect was or what he had done. The history of the architect, once the trial was concluded and the conglomerate was dismantled, began to fade into the digital ether. His story became a footnote in the history of the internet, a piece of trivia for true crime enthusiasts, a cautionary anecdote for ethics classes. The public fascination had shifted, as it always does, toward newer, more modern horrors, leaving Penhaligon to his concrete walls and his isolation. He had achieved his original goal. He was once again invisible. But it was a different kind of invisibility, not the invisibility of a master operative, but the invisibility of the forgotten, the irrelevant, and the defeated. He had spent his life removing others from the world, and in the end, the world had simply removed him, relegating him to the silence he had once commodified. Vane, meanwhile, found himself in a place of profound, quiet stability. He had sold his home in the city, the apartment that had been filled with files, stacks of paper, and the oppressive, lingering tension of the investigation, and had embraced the open, rhythmic space of the mountains. He had finally allowed himself to be a person, not a detective. He spent his days in the simplicity of nature, the complexities of the Thorn case finally replaced by the simple, beautiful, and eternal cycle of the seasons. He found that the truth, while it had been a hard and uncompromising master for 30 years, had ultimately been a path to his own freedom. He had freed Julian Thorn, he had freed the victims of the conglomerate, and in the process, he had finally, truly freed himself from the architecture of his own obsession. As the winter deepened, the mountains were covered in a silent, thick, and beautiful white shroud. The world seemed to stop, the frantic noise of the modern era muffled by the snow, and Vane sat in his cabin, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. He picked up his old, worn leather journal, the one he had once thought about destroying, and instead placed it on a shelf beside his books. It was a record, not of a mystery, but of a life lived in the service of an absolute, unwavering belief that even the darkest, most carefully hidden secret must eventually come into the light. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the wind howl outside, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the wind, or the cold, or the secrets that might still be waiting for someone else to uncover. He was home. The case was closed, the records were sealed, and for the man who had spent his life chasing the architect of death, the only thing that mattered now was the quiet, steady, and peaceful reality of the dawn that would come tomorrow. The transformation of the Thorn case from a decades-long cold mystery into a definitive, historical ledger of corporate and criminal malfeasance had reached its terminal phase by the summer of 2026. The atmosphere in Atlanta was no longer one of suspicion or dark rumors. The city had moved into an era of stark, technological clarity. The architect was no longer a shadow, but an aging man in a cell, and the conglomerate that had once treated human lives as disposable variables in a financial equation had been effectively deleted from the corporate registry. For the legal teams, the archivists, and the investigators who had spent the better part of a year documenting the collapse of the network, the focus had shifted from the pursuit of the guilty to the preservation of the truth. They were building a digital monument to the case, a repository of evidence, so comprehensive that it would serve as the foundational text for every future generation of forensic professionals. Within the walls of the state penitentiary, Arthur Penhaligon had reached a state of terminal, almost monastic, isolation. He had become an object of study, a man who had survived the implosion of his own life's work to become a ghost trapped in a cage. The prison administration had moved him to a specialized, high-security wing where he was, by all accounts, a model of compliance. He spent his days in a cycle of silent reflection, his hands calloused from the simple, repetitive labor of the prison workshop, a man who had once wielded the power to dismantle empires now relegated to the assembly of mundane hardware components. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his career removing the inefficient parts of a system, only to be deemed an inefficient part himself and removed by the very system he had helped construct. The broader forensic and investigative community had adopted the Thorn investigation as the new gold standard for cold case resolution. The methodology used by Vane and his team, the integration of deep financial mapping, the forensic reconstruction of legacy server data, and the aggressive application of multi-generational genetic genealogy, was now being taught as the Vane-Thorn protocol. It was a paradigm shift that prioritized the digital afterlife of a crime over the traditional, physical evidence that time inevitably degrades. Investigators across the country were no longer just looking for the murder weapon, they were looking for the digital footprint of the motive. The success of the Atlanta Task Force had effectively ended the era of the unsolvable crime, as the tools were now available to trace even the most complex, multi-layered deceptions back to their source. Detective Marcus Vane, having successfully navigated the transition from hunter to consultant and finally to a man of private, quiet life in the North Georgia mountains, found that the world he had spent his life protecting had changed in ways he could barely have imagined. The city of Atlanta was now an urban landscape defined by radical, technology-enabled transparency. Every major institution, the hospitals, the school districts, the municipal governments, operated under a system of open, encrypted logs that made it impossible to hide the kind of systemic, long-term corruption that had defined the Thorne era. The case had served as the ultimate catalyst for this change, acting as a traumatic, necessary, and ultimately purifying experience for the civic identity of the city. He walked through the city on his occasional visits, feeling like a man returning to a place he had helped build but no longer entirely recognized. The memorial grounds at the former Thorne estate had evolved into a place of genuine, civic healing. The Vance Miller Protocols, named for the broader movement of transparency, were now etched into the city's identity. The park was not merely a place of remembrance for Julian Thorne or the victims of the conglomerate. It was a space for the living. During the weekends, it was filled with the sound of music, the play of children, and the calm, steady rhythm of a community that had finally exorcised its collective ghosts. Vane often visited the park during his trips to the city, sitting on a bench near the memorial, watching the life that had been made possible by the resolution of a mystery that had once seemed destined to stay buried. He saw the resilience of the human spirit in the way the city had reclaimed the ground where such terrible, calculated violence had been enacted. The archive of the case, now officially housed in the state's digital repository, was a living record of the investigation's evolution. It spanned over 4 decades of documentation, from the original, grainy police reports of 1999 to the sophisticated, multidimensional digital maps of 2026. Anyone with the proper credentials could access the archive, tracing the path of every dollar, every communication, and every decision that had led to the execution of Julian Thorne and the subsequent, 3-decade-long cover-up. It was a transparent, searchable record of human darkness and institutional hubris, a permanent lesson on the consequences of unchecked power. The file was, in the most literal sense, the end of the mystery. There was no longer any room for theory, no room for speculation, and no room for the architect to hide. As the late months of 2026 passed, the legal and criminal history of Atlanta entered a new chapter. The trials were over, the appeals had been exhausted, and the individuals responsible for the most egregious abuses of the conglomerate had either been incarcerated or had seen their reputations permanently, irretrievably destroyed. The city had begun to look ahead, focusing on the development of its digital infrastructure and the expansion of its role as a leader in forensic science and corporate transparency. The story of the Thorne case had become a foundational myth, a cautionary tale of what happens when a society permits the existence of a shadow government, and a testament to the fact that no system, no matter how powerful, is immune to the persistent, uncompromising light of the truth. In his cabin, Vane found that the silence was no longer a weight, but a sanctuary. He spent the winter evenings working on his own final memoir of the case, not as a thriller or a piece of true crime sensationalism, but as a technical and philosophical study of the nature of truth in the modern world. He wrote about the long, exhausting, and often lonely years of the investigation, the moments of despair when the leads dried up, and the slow, inevitable breakthrough that had finally brought the architect to justice. He wrote about the toll that the pursuit of the truth takes on the pursuer, and the ultimate, necessary release that comes when the mission is finally complete. It was a process of catharsis, a way to organize the last 30 years of his life into a coherent, meaningful narrative. As the end of the year approached, Vane sat on his porch, watching the light dance over the snowy peaks. The world was cold, but the interior of his cabin was warm, filled with the presence of a man who had finally, truly, let go. The hunt was over, the mystery was extinguished, and for Julian Thorne, for the families of the 99, and for the city that had lived through the darkness of the 90s, the story had finally found its conclusion. The architect was just a name in a file, the conglomerate was just a memory, and the man who had been the architect of his own, singular life had finally found the peace he had been denied for so long. He closed his journal, set it aside, and for the first time in his life, didn't look at the clock, didn't check the files, and didn't wait for the phone to ring. He was home. The case was closed, the records were sealed, and for the man who had spent his life chasing the shadows, the dawn of a new, bright, and completely mystery-free future was already, inevitably, on its way. The conclusion of the Thorne narrative, as it reached the mid-year point of 2026, had transcended the boundaries of a simple cold case resolution. It had become an emblem of the city's total rebirth. Atlanta, a metropolis that had spent the better part of 3 decades wrestling with the lingering, spectral presence of the 99 unsolved contract killings and the singular, chilling death of Julian Thorne, had emerged into a state of stark, digitized transparency. The era of the architect, defined by shadows and institutional impunity, was dead. In its place stood a governance model that prioritized the open, encrypted ledger as the primary tool of civil order. The city's history, once fractured by the secrets of the 90s, was finally being stitched together into a coherent, honest, and unadorned account of its own past. For the forensic archivists tasked with the final preservation of the case, the task was no longer investigative. It was monumental, a process of cementing the truth into the bedrock of the state's historical identity. In the high-security facility where Arthur Penhaligon remained, the world had continued to shrink until it was composed of nothing but the immediate, tactile reality of his confinement. The man who had once been the invisible blade of the city's corporate elite had become the most closely monitored individual in the correctional system. His existence was an empty vessel, a life cycle of repetitive, mundane actions that stood in direct, mocking contrast to the complex, lethal orchestration of his previous career. The prison staff, recognizing that the architect's value had shifted from operational to intellectual, had occasionally sought his input on non-sensitive forensic protocols, a strange, perverse form of consultation that allowed Penhaligon to remain, in his own way, still tethered to the very systems of control he had helped refine. He remained an observer of the world he had left behind, a man watching through a keyhole as the city he had terrorized finally outgrew the need for his particular, lethal service. The broader investigative community, meanwhile, had fully internalized the Vainthorne Protocol, making it the bedrock of contemporary criminal intelligence. No longer was a case deemed cold, simply because the physical evidence was missing. If the digital footprint remained, the case was considered active. This shift had triggered a global domino effect, as agencies from London to Tokyo adopted the same data mapping methodologies that had dismantled the Thorne conglomerate. The success of the Atlanta Task Force was not just a local victory, it was a demonstration of the power of persistence in the age of information. The tools that had allowed Detective Vane to turn a 30-year-old murder into a fully mapped criminal history were now the standard-issue equipment for every major police department, effectively closing the chapter on the era where criminals could rely on the passage of time to act as their primary defense. Marcus Vane, living in the serene isolation of his North Georgia mountain retreat, found that the quiet he had worked so hard to cultivate had become the most valuable possession he owned. The transition from the high-octane environment of the precinct to the slow, intentional rhythm of his retirement was finally complete. He had stopped checking the news for updates on the conglomerate's remaining assets, he had stopped looking for the telltale signatures of a professional hit, and he had, in a profound, internal shift, stopped identifying as a man on the hunt. The mountains were a place of deep, grounding stability, a landscape that was entirely indifferent to the machinations of corporate power or the cold calculations of an assassin. He spent his days in the simple, restorative labor of his garden, his hands now calloused from the earth rather than the handling of files, a man who had finally reconciled the hunter with the human being. The Memorial Park, now fully integrated into the civic life of the Atlanta Buckhead District, had become more than just a place of quiet reflection. It was a community center, a site of constant, vibrant interaction where the past was remembered, but the future was prioritized. The monument to the victims, Julian Thorne and the many others whose names had been surfaced by the digital investigation, was a point of civic pride, a place where the city could point to its own recovery as an example of what is possible when the truth is demanded. Vane's rare visits were always marked by a sense of profound detachment. He would watch the young people who played on the lawns, unaware of the history beneath their feet, and he would realize that the best result of his life's work was that the mystery had become so irrelevant, so completely resolved, that it no longer posed a threat to anyone's peace of mind. The archival team, tasked with the final preservation of the case, had reached the end of their mission. The repository was complete, a multi-terabyte library of human error, corporate greed, and the ultimate triumph of the truth-seeking process. The file, once the most restricted and closely guarded secret of the precinct, was now a searchable, public-facing document available for researchers, historians, and students of the law. The transparency was complete. The architect's methods were public, the conglomerate's internal communications were laid bare, and the systemic failures that had allowed the crime to happen were analyzed in excruciating, pedagogical detail. The story had been moved from the realm of the unknown to the realm of the known, leaving no gaps for the conspiracists or the dreamers to exploit. The mystery was not just solved, it was neutralized. In the final weeks of the year, as the mountain snow began to settle over Vane's cabin, he found himself thinking about the nature of his own life's obsession. He had spent his career trying to fix a broken world, trying to force the truth out of the darkness, and he had finally succeeded, but he realized that the world had never been as broken as he had thought. It was just complex, and it required a certain, relentless kind of attention to keep the gears turning honestly. He was not a savior. He was a detective, and he had fulfilled his duty. The case was closed, the records were sealed, and for the first time in his long, complicated life, he was content to simply exist in a world that didn't need to be saved. He sat by his hearth, the firelight flickering against the walls, and watched the snow fall. The legacy of the architect, as the final chapter of the Atlanta narrative, had become a permanent part of the state's forensic canon. It was a story that would continue to be told in classrooms, in precinct briefings, and in the quiet, reflective discussions of investigators who understood that the truth is never truly buried. The name of Arthur Penhaligon would remain in the files, a name associated with the cold, methodical cruelty of the 90s, but the city that had once been defined by that cruelty had successfully moved beyond it. The case was no longer a weight on the heart of the community. It was a finished, filed, and forgotten entry in the archives of a city that had finally and correctly learned how to tell the truth about its own history. As the sun began to set on the final day of the project, Vane went out to his porch and looked toward the city, which was now a distant, glowing horizon of light. He felt the profound, quiet weight of a life lived for a singular, necessary purpose, and he realized that the mission had been a success, not just in catching the killer, but in demonstrating the absolute, unyielding power of the truth. He was at peace. The architect was in chains, the conglomerate was in the past, and for the man who had spent 30 years hunting ghosts, the dawn of a new, completely mystery-free future was already, inevitably, on its way. He leaned back, let out a slow, steady breath, and watched the stars emerge over the mountains, the quiet, silent witnesses to a world that was finally, at long last, whole.